Hi everyone, I'm Molly Kingsley from Usforthem, and this is the next in our series of exposés in which we delve into serious failings of ethics, decision making, and governance during the pandemic. And I think many of us would say that there was no starker example of such failings than the series of events leading to the vaccination of children against COVID-19 in the autumn of 2021. And I have, in that regard, a very interesting document here. I'm going to show it, and you guys can also see it on the screen. And what this is minutes of the meetings of the four Joint Chief Medical Officers of the UK, dated from the first week in September 2021. And that was the period when, as some of you will doubtless remember, the Chief Medical Officers decided to push ahead with the mass vaccination of 12 to 15-year-olds in the UK, despite the fact that the UK's own panel of vaccine experts, the Jcvi, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, had declined to authorise a mass vaccine rollout. And that was an event which left many of us just absolutely shell-shocked. I mean, just speaking for myself, I could not believe that could happen here. It's clear from what has happened since to rates of childhood immunisation that single act has done so much damage to trust in public health and, of course, childhood immunisations more generally. And in that context, because this is the kind of thing we do at Usforthem, we decided it would be very interesting to look behind the detail and see the minutes of that meeting. And slightly, we applied under Freedom of Information Act request, I should say, a few weeks ago. Slightly surprisingly, given how some of our other Freedom of Information Act requests have gone recently, we were actually given the minutes, and we're going to make them public on our website too. So before I delve into the detail of what the minutes say, and as I say, they are very interesting both for what they do and they don't say, let me just give you a couple of minutes of context. Because as some of you from the UK at least will remember, that whole period when politicians were considering whether to roll out the COVID vaccine to kids was just incredibly fraught. And I know that many of us felt deeply uneasy about giving a product to children that had no long-term or even medium-term safety data. I mean, absent a disease that really, really threatened children, and we knew that COVID, thankfully, was not that disease for the vast majority of children. We knew that from very early on. And I think absent that kind of disease, many of us felt that to mass authorize a product for children without long-term safety data was just the epitome of recklessness. That's only my opinion, of course, but it is my opinion. But all of that said, the context here is at the beginning it had looked like the UK was actually going to be a very admirable outlier in resisting the international pressure to vaccinate children. So in the autumn of 2020, various high-profile individuals had gone on record to say that kids wouldn't be vaccinated. So Kate Bingham had said there's going to be no vaccination of people under 18. It's an adult-only vaccine for people over 50. Actually, before that, about 6 months before that, Chris Whitty, our CMO, had said that for a disease with a low mortality, a vaccine has to be very safe. So the safety studies can't be shortcut. And for the best part of a year, the government's panel of expert vaccine advisors, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, Jcvi, held that line. And they were asked repeatedly to look at the issue of childhood vaccination for COVID, and repeatedly they declined to authorise it. And in declining, they also made some very clear, very welcome statements. So in July 2021, quite late, they actually said the health benefits of universal vaccination in children and young people below the age of 18 do not outweigh the potential risks. And it was really against that backdrop that over the late summer of 2021, political pressure began to build and build towards a narrative that children would be vaccinated. And actually, just a few weeks after that July Jcvi meeting, they met again. And to the shock and horror of many of us, they decided to do a U-turn on their previous decision. And the Jcvi went ahead and authorised the mass rollout to 16 and 17-year-olds. In so doing, they still declined to recommend a rollout down the age groups. So they still held the line, even in early September 2021, saying, no, actually, we don't think this is suitable for mass rollout to younger teenagers. And they said there is considerable uncertainty regarding the magnitude of potential harms. And I think many of us felt that should have put an end to the matter. It was a clear statement. And of course, you shouldn't be giving a product to children where there is uncertainty about unknown serious harms. Of course, you shouldn't. But sadly, it wasn't the end of the matter, because whilst they did decline to recommend a mass rollout, the JCVI within that same meeting effectively passed the buck to the chief medical officers of the UK. And what the JCVI said is, well, look, we've made a clinical recommendation, but CMOs, if you want to look at broader factors and come to a different view, then go ahead. And unsurprisingly, given the huge political and international pressure at the time, when the CMOs met, and that is the meeting that we have the minutes for here, when the CMOs met, they did make a different decision. And it's that decision and what is evidenced and not evidenced by the minutes that I want to talk to you about today. So what do the minutes actually say? Well, to an extent, they confirm what we already know of the rationale of vaccinating kids. So although these minutes have not been published before, what was published at the time the CMOs decided to go ahead with this is a rationale for their decision. And in that, it was very clear that the primary driver for wanting to vaccinate kids was a desire to keep them in school. Now, of course, while that might not be unreasonable, many of us pointed out that there were serious issues with that argument even at the time. So people like David Payton, very respected professor of industrial economics, he pointed out that actually even according to the CMO's own core modelling assumptions, at best a child could expect to be saved 15 minutes of school disruption. Someone else pointed out that actually the time taken to vaccinate them was likely to be longer than that. In addition, I think many of us felt viscerally uneasy about an argument that relied on a pharmaceutical intervention, let alone a pharmaceutical intervention without any long-term safety data, being used to solve for something which was effectively a policy choice. School closures and the testing that led to school closures at that time were policy choices. So the answer is to change the policy, not to vaccinate children, surely. Beyond that, though, there is quite a lot of nuance in these minutes that is interesting and is not reflected in the published advice from 2021. So, the minutes do reveal that there was an apparent divergence of views on this issue and, to be fair, some genuine hand-wringing about whether or not to proceed. So just one example, the CMO of Scotland, he is recorded as setting out a degree of scepticism, and he points out, completely rightly as it transpired, that the modelling for any potential impact on schools has a wide range of assumptions, and he also fretted, again, sadly, correctly, about the incidence of myocarditis among healthy children. Others worried about damage that could be done to vaccinations more generally. And the other point that comes across from reading the minutes is that informed consent and clear communication was absolutely key. And there are a number of statements across each set of minutes to that effect. So, the minutes for the 4 CMOs meeting, the critical meeting, finish, in fact, by saying that the CMOs agreed that a clear informed consent programme would be essential and that clear communication is also important. And you have to ask what happened to that, don't you? Because, this idea of nuanced, clear communication just went out of the window as soon as the whole thing began. In fact, really even before it began. So these minutes were on 7th of September. On the 20th of September, so not even 2 weeks after this, we have the deputy lead for the NHS vaccine programme saying in a press release that the vaccine is safe and effective, and I would urge families to work closely with their schools to get their loved ones vaccinated. And in that same release, there's a child quoted saying, "I am proud to have my vaccination so that I can remain in school and continue in my education. The jab was quick, easy and painless." So where is the nuance? Where does it come across that this is a finely balanced decision? Where is the mention of risk? There is none. In December, just a few months later, we have the Department of Education, of all people, saying that, in fact, this was advertising, saying that the vaccines give your children the best possible protection against the virus and help keep them in school. Again, there was no mention of natural immunity, which was known to be superior even then, and there was no mention of risk. I think just stepping back, one would argue how it was possibly thought that this was going to be a program that could be given in compliance with principles of truly informed voluntary consent. Because, of course, by this point, this was autumn 2021, the vaccine rollout had taken a deeply sinister and coercive turn. In the UK, we had vaccine passports at that point being needed for travel. Well, what are they if not a semi-coercive measure to increase vaccine uptake, including in children? And of course, it all went even further downhill from them with further mandates, a care home mandate, and so on in the UK. We carried out some polling last year, towards the end of last year, which backed up this idea that informed consent had been entirely subverted. This was independent polling of over 2,000 people. It was a nationally representative sample, and the results were really, really interesting. Because what the survey confirmed was that less than half of the parents surveyed had been aware that the COVID vaccine had only been granted a provisional MHRA authorisation at the point it was offered to kids in December 2021. Of course, we haven't really even talked about that, but the vaccine didn't have full authorisation at that point, and it turns out most parents did not know that. 60% of parents of children under 18 were unaware that the Jcvi had declined to recommend the rollout of the vaccine for 12 to 15-year-olds, and just 1 in 3 parents said that they would still have wanted to proceed getting their kids vaccinated had they understood those bits of context. That was really, really damning polling. As so much of what we talk about in the series, we tried to give that polling to mainstream press. I think I'm right in saying it was offered across all print media, and no one wanted to publish it. So I mentioned that the meeting minutes are as interesting for what they don't record as what they do, and it's to that I want to turn now. So the first point I want to make on this is about conflicts of interest. So, as many of you will know, the flow of money and support between pharmaceutical companies, and especially including the major vaccine manufacturers, and the UK's health ecosystem are extensive and in some cases concerning. That is a topic we're going to be coming back to probably repeatedly over the coming weeks. But for now, all I want to say is that the key meeting of the 4 chief medical officers on the 7th of September followed 2 earlier meetings, and they were meetings where the CMOs took advice from a range of public health experts, advisors, and royal colleges. So places like the Royal College of Medicine, the Royal College of General Practitioners. And as is customary in such meetings, one would expect any conflicts of interest to be recorded. And in fact, there's a statement in the meeting minutes with the Royal Colleges saying just that. What it says is those consulted should state any conflicts of interest before any interventions, i.e. before speaking. And one would have expected, particularly in this meeting, this was a really, really critical meeting. It was an incredibly controversial meeting. Surely, if there was a major conflict of interest, it would have been recorded. Yet it appears that there is at least one institution who advocated for proceeding with childhood COVID vaccination who did appear to have a major conflict of interest and failed to disclose that. So the Royal College of General Practitioners came out with a really strong statement in favour of vaccinating kids. They said that the Royal College of GPs have consulted widely across GPs, and there is a strong consensus in favour of vaccinating 12 to 15s. What they didn't say, though, was that according to the APBI database, which is where one can publicly search financial transactions between pharmaceutical companies and at least some healthcare companies and individuals. What they didn't say was that in 2020 they took a donation of £50,000 from Pfizer, and of course it was the Pfizer vaccine that was being offered to kids and which was the subject of this very meeting. And indeed they took a further 100 grand in 2021, a further 280 grand in 2022, and a further 130 in 2023. Now, of course, that CMOs meeting was September 21, and no one can be expected to disclose money they haven't taken at that point. But by 2021, it was clear that the Royal College of GPs were in a financial arrangement with Pfizer. And I guess many of us will be asking, looking at that, first of all, potentially, why was that institution in the meeting? But having got into the meeting, why the hell was that significant financial conflict of interest not recorded in these minutes? So just another example, a slightly less direct conflict, admittedly, but the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, so really the key Royal College in this meeting, one assumes, well, in 2019 they'd taken £40,000, so not an insignificant sum from GlaxoSmithKline. Now, the GSK weren't offering a product to children in this meeting, which is why I say it's not a direct conflict, but clearly they're a major pharmaceutical company who do manufacture vaccines. So again, it's indicative of a mindset of taking money from vaccine manufacturers. And I think many of us would say in matters such as this, which, even on their own terms are very finely balanced and which impact the health of millions of children, why not disclose that to the public? Like, we can't expect the public and parents in particular to trust public health if we're not getting full information. And if you think that is shocking, wait until you hear this. So, as I've said, many of us were appalled by this decision, and I think we're left asking, whatever the technical nuance around clinical benefit, like ethically, how had this been allowed to happen? Because really what was happening here is children were being vaccinated to protect their elders, they were being vaccinated to guard against a policy decision, as we've said, that stank, for want of a better word. And it's really noticeable that in these meetings, so 3 very key meetings with very senior, and in fact really all of the UK's senior public health people, or many of them, so you've got the 4 CMOs, you've got the Jcvi, you've got people that have been convened specifically for their public health expertise, you've got the Royal Colleges in these meetings over these 2 days. Yet in the totality of those people in these meetings, there isn't a single mention of ethics. And that struck us as really, really odd because, surely the ethics of vaccinating millions of children for a disease with a very, very low risk to them and with no long-term safety profile attached to the pharmaceutical, surely the ethics of that had been considered. Yet it's not obvious from these meeting minutes they had been. There isn't a single reference. And it's a little known fact, but during the pandemic there was actually a specialist expert ethics committee. Now, we're going to be returning to this because I personally believe it is one of the darkest, if not the darkest, stories, untold stories so far of the entire pandemic, but we'll be doing a separate session on it. For now, though, I'm just going to give you a teaser. So there was this specialist ethics committee. It was called MEAG, the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group. And that committee predated the pandemic, but advising on pandemic matters was very surely within its remit. And actually, for the first year or so of the pandemic, it did advise on pandemic matters. It met weekly. And it had set out its intention to advise on childhood vaccination against COVID. And as the time came nearer for that, so in the run up to late summer 2021, it did start advising on that. And actually, the committee, this all expert committee, they made clear that they had serious concerns about vaccinating kids on the basis that the vaccines were invasive, irreversible, and may have long-term side effects. And they put those concerns in writing. However, Before the concerns could be formally discussed with the Department for Health or the CMOs, the committee were sent on what can only be really described as an extended sabbatical. So there had been a meeting June 2021 that was due to be held, talking specifically about this issue, you know, the many ethical issues involved in vaccinating kids. The meeting got cancelled at short notice, the day before it was due to be held. Crucially, it got cancelled after this note had been circulated. We don't know whether that played a factor at all. And the group were not convened until, quite shockingly, the day after the CMOs had made their decision. So the CMOs made their decision to push ahead with the vaccination of kids on the 7th of September. As I say, it is not clear whether any ethical input was sought by the CMOs or received. It would be very good to understand that. MEAG, the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group, were not reconvened until the 8th of September. And unbelievably, when they were then reconvened, they were not allowed to talk about kids' vaccination against COVID. So MEAG were only allowed to talk about issues that they had been asked to advise on. And on this occasion, despite the fact that it was the day after possibly the most ethically contentious decision of the entire pandemic, they were asked to advise on virginity testing. And actually, MEAG limped on for a few months after that, but they were never again asked or allowed to advise and input on pandemic or vaccination related topics. And I think we have some questions in light of that. So, you know, first of all, whose decision was it to disband the ethics committee at this moment of critical ethical jeopardy for children? You know, why were they not reconvened? Was that an active choice? Was it accident? Was the committee's strongly stated concerns about the vaccination of children a factor in that? And finally, the key question, you know, what ethical input was sought by the CMOs and received by the CMOs before they decided to overturn the government's own vaccine advisors and push ahead with the vaccination of children for COVID? And I just want to leave with two concluding thoughts to end with. And the first really is the context of this second bite approach, this idea that Jcvi might decline to authorise a product for mass deployment to the population, but that the chief medical officers could still go ahead and override that decision. As far as we have been able to find out, that never happened before 2021, nor has it happened since. It seems still to us to be absolutely unprecedented and really quite unorthodox. Yet, if you listen to what Chris Whitty had to say about it back in 2021, you might be mistaken for thinking it was a normal, or at least a more normal occurrence. So giving evidence in front of the Education Select Committee in September 2021 after the Jcvi override, Whitty had said, and I'm quoting here, that in the situation where MHRA have authorised a vaccine but Jcvi have declined to authorise it for deployment to the population, the CMOs are kind of third umpire. And that's curious because, as I've said, we can't find another instance of it happening, nor can we see any documentation anywhere that it was even envisaged it might happen. And I think we might question whether Whitty's description of that override to the Select Committee perhaps suggests a degree of normalcy which wasn't reflected by previous events. Actually, in a meeting of the Science and Technology Committee later that year in December, Jeremy Hunt, chair of the committee at the time, candidly described the CMO's recommendation as a workaround. So I think my final question really is just to ask, where is the COVID inquiry in all of this? Because, you know, these were really serious issues and many of us have been left very shaken by what happened in 2021. You know, we're seeing now the knock-on impact in terms of lack of trust in public health and in particular childhood immunisations. Like, this all ties into it, of course it does. And yet, as far as we are aware, there hasn't been a single mention of this desperately unorthodox period of decision making in the COVID inquiry. And that is very, very odd, because although the module on children is yet to come, we've already had the module on high-level decision-making. That was module 2, and one would certainly have expected decisions such as this, decisions affecting millions of citizens, albeit children, to have been looked at. Likewise, one would have expected an issue of a disappearing ethics committee to have been picked up, and yet so far we haven't heard any reference to it. Hopefully that will be corrected going forward. I would say that, obviously we've been talking about meeting minutes. There's a lot of background that's gone into this. Everything that I've said here is referenced and footnoted. I don't usually do this because I don't like doing needless plugs, but we wrote a book about a year ago, The Accountability Deficit, that details quite a lot of the issues I've talked about, particularly around Jcvi and around the ethics committee. There are meticulous footnotes, so anyone that wants to go and check, it's all here, including the COVID inquiry lawyers. If you want to get into some of this, that would be good. Anyway, that's all. Thank you everyone for listening. Oh, and actually, sorry, one other thing I was going to say is, thank you for listening, and actually really thank you for the support and feedback on these. Like, obviously we're looking at all your comments with real interest, and it's just so great to see that so many of you feel as strongly as we do about the ongoing issues and the lack of accountability for some of these appalling failings. So watch this space. All right, thank you.